You ever see a symbol that wasn't meant to be understood? The question drifted through the low hum of the diner just as the door opened and the air shifted, boots striking tile with a weight that didn't belong to civilians. Delta operators moving in with quiet confidence, scanning, measuring, owning the room without saying a word, until one of them slowed, eyes narrowing on a man seated alone near the window. Samuel Crow, late 70s, maybe early 80s, posture relaxed, hands steady around a chipped ceramic mug, like the world outside that. Glass didn't concern him anymore. Sunlight catching the faded ink on his forearm. A circle, crude lines, something old, something wrong. Ethan Voss noticed it first, a smirk forming before he even reached the table. That's supposed to mean something? He asked, voice light but edged, the kind of tone that didn't ask for answers. Only reactions. Samuel didn't look up, didn't shift, didn't acknowledge the weight standing over him. Just took a slow sip, like he'd heard worse and forgotten it faster. The others gathered, curiosity turning into quiet amusement. Elite soldiers studying what they assumed was a relic, a man out of time. Ethan leaned closer, tapping the table once, then nodding toward the tattoo. Never seen that unit before, he said, casual, dismissive, doesn't exist. A few of the others chuckled under their breath, the sound bouncing off chrome and glass, blending with the faint hiss of the coffee machine behind the counter. Samuel finally moved. Not much, just enough to set the mug down, ceramic touching wood with a soft, deliberate click, his eyes lifting, pale, steady, unreadable, meeting Ethan's without challenge, without fear, just presence. That's the point, he said, voice low, gravel thin but solid, like it had been carried through too many years to break now. The table went still, not silent, not yet, but something in the air shifted, subtle, almost imperceptible, like pressure dropping before a storm. Ethan's smirk tightened, not gone, but sharper. Now, testing, probing, right, he muttered, reaching out, finger extending toward the faded lines on Samuel's arm. A simple gesture, careless, dismissive, like brushing dust off a forgotten story. And the moment his skin made contact, everything changed, not loudly, not visibly, but in a way that made the light feel different. The room narrower. Samuel's gaze flickered, just for a fraction of a second, something ancient moving behind it, something that didn't belong in a roadside diner. And across the room, unnoticed by most, a young military police officer named Lucas Reed straightened slightly, his instincts catching something his mind hadn't processed yet, because whatever that symbol meant, it wasn't a joke, and whatever man sat at that table, he wasn't just an old veteran waiting out the afternoon. The contact lingered a second too long, not enough for anyone to call it out, but enough for Samuel Crow to slowly pull his arm back, not defensive, not angry, just deliberate, like a man reclaiming something that had never been meant for anyone else to touch. And the shift was subtle but real, the kind of shift seasoned men felt before they could explain it. Ethan Voss straightened slightly, his smirk still there, but thinner now, like it no longer fit as comfortably as it had a moment ago. Relax, he said, glancing at his team as if to anchor the moment back in control. Just asking questions. But Samuel did not respond, his eyes no longer on Ethan, drifting instead to the window, to the pale reflection of himself in the glass. And for a brief instant something deeper surfaced. Not emotion, not memory. Exactly, but the weight of something carried for too long to ever fully set down. The diner continued around them, silverware clinking, low voices murmuring, but at their table the air felt sealed, contained, like sound itself was hesitant to cross it. Across the room Lucas Reed shifted his stance again, his gaze fixed now on the old man's forearm, on the faded ink that should have meant nothing but did not. He had seen thousands of insignias in training manuals, patches, markings, unit identifiers, but this was different. It was wrong in a way he could not define. Like a symbol that had been erased instead of forgotten. He reached slowly for his phone, keeping it low, his movements careful, because whatever instinct was pulling at him, it was not something to ignore. Back at the table one of the other operators leaned in, curiosity overtaking amusement. Where did you even get that? He asked, not mocking this time, just probing, trying to place it, trying to make sense of something that refused to fit. Samuel finally spoke again, his voice quieter now. almost distant. A long time ago, he said. And that was all. No elaboration, no story, just a line that closed more doors than it opened. Ethan exhaled through his nose, a faint irritation creeping in, because control was slipping in a way he did not like, not visibly, not enough for anyone else to call out, but enough for him to feel it. You know, he said, folding his arms. People were things they did not earn all the time. The words hung there, not an accusation, not quite, but close enough to test the boundary. Samuel did not react, did not defend, did not explain, and somehow that made it worse, because there was nothing to push against, nothing to dismantle, just silence that refused to bend. Lucas turned slightly, stepping toward the hallway that led to the restrooms, already dialing, his thumb hesitating only once before pressing the call. The line connected faster than he expected, a voice on the other end sharp, professional. Lucas kept his tone low, controlled. I need a quick verification, he said, eyes still on the table behind him. Unregistered marking, possible legacy unit. I think you are going to want to check this. There was a pause, short, then a question, one word. Description. Lucas swallowed, glancing once more at the symbol burned into Samuel's skin. Circle, he said quietly. 5 points inside. The silence on the other end stretched just a fraction longer than it should have, and when the voice returned, it had changed, not louder, not panicked, but tighter, more focused. Stay where you are, it said. Do not engage. Lucas lowered the phone slowly, a chill settling in his chest that had nothing to do with the air conditioning, because whatever that tattoo meant, it had just reached someone who understood it, and they had not asked for more details. They had not questioned it. They had simply reacted. The call did not echo. It did not escalate in volume, but it moved, invisible and fast, cutting through layers of command that most men in that diner would never even know existed. And somewhere miles away in a quiet office lined with maps and old photographs, a man stopped mid-sentence, the voice on the phone speaking just 3 words that pulled everything else into silence. Circle, 5 points. And General Daniel Cross did not ask for clarification, did not ask for confirmation. He simply stood up, chair sliding back across polished wood with a low, final sound, because there were symbols that did not belong in reports, symbols that were never printed, never archived, symbols that only lived in memory and in the scars of the few who survived them. Back in the diner, Ethan Voss shifted his weight, the unease now real, not visible to his team, but present in the way his eyes lingered just a fraction longer on Samuel Crow, trying to place him, trying to reconcile the calm with the story he wanted to believe. You got a name? He asked, tone flatter now, less mocking, more controlled. Samuel did not answer immediately, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table, tracing a slow, almost absent line along the grain of the wood, like he had done it 1,000 times before in 1,000 different places. Names do not matter much anymore, he said finally, and the words landed heavier than they should have, because they were not defiant, they were not proud, they were simply true. One of the operators let out a quiet breath, glancing at Ethan as if waiting for direction, for a cue to either push forward or step back, but Ethan gave none, because for the first time since walking in, he was not entirely sure which direction was forward. Across the room, Lucas remained still, phone lowered but not put away, his attention fixed on the entrance now, because something was coming. He did not know what, only that the response had been too fast, too precise to be routine. The minutes stretched, not long in reality, maybe 60 seconds, maybe 90, but long enough for the tension to settle into every corner of the room. Conversations fading, eyes drifting, people sensing without understanding that something was unfolding just beyond their reach. The door opened again, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that drew every gaze without effort. A single man stepped inside, no entourage, no announcement, just presence, older, composed, his uniform simple but unmistakable, and the moment his eyes found Samuel Crow, something shifted again, deeper this time, final, like a line being drawn that could not be crossed back. Lucas felt it before anyone else, the recognition, the weight of it, his posture straightening without thought. While at the table, Ethan Voss turned, following the direction of the room's attention, his expression tightening as he took in the figure at the door. because even without introductions, even without words, he knew exactly who had just walked in. And whatever control he thought he had a few minutes ago was gone. No one announced him. No one needed to. The room recognized authority the way the body recognizes gravity. Instantly, and without question, General Daniel Cross walked forward at an even pace. Each step measured, controlled, his gaze locked not on the Delta operators, not on the curious faces turning in quiet confusion, but on Samuel Crowe, and only Samuel Crowe, as if the rest of the world had narrowed to a single point in space. Ethan Voss straightened instinctively, his team following half a beat behind, posture tightening, shoulders squaring, the casual edge gone, replaced by something more formal, more alert, because men like Cross did not appear in places like this without reason, and whatever that reason was, it was standing right in front of them. The general stopped a few feet from the table, close enough to see the lines etched into Samuel's face, the years carried in silence, close enough to see the faded ink on his forearm, and for a moment, just a fraction of a second, something passed through his expression, not surprise, not confusion, but recognition layered with something deeper, something almost personal, the kind of recognition that does not come from files or briefings, but from memory, from moments that never made it into official records. The room held its breath without realizing it, the hum of the diner fading into the background, replaced by a stillness that pressed in from all sides. Samuel did not move, did not stand, did not acknowledge the shift in rank or presence. He simply looked up, meeting the general's eyes with the same quiet steadiness he had shown from the beginning. Two men facing each other without introduction, without ceremony, and yet the weight between them was undeniable. Ethan glanced between them, the uncertainty now fully formed, because this was not how these encounters were supposed to go. There were protocols, expectations, a chain of command that defined every interaction, and none of it applied here. "Sir," Ethan began, his voice controlled but edged with the need to re-establish order. "We were just—" The general raised a single hand, not sharply, not aggressively, just enough to stop the sentence before it could finish, and Ethan fell silent immediately, the words dying in his throat as if they had never been spoken. General Cross did not look at him, did not acknowledge him, his attention never leaving Samuel. "You always did prefer the quiet corners," the general said, his voice low, steady, carrying just enough to reach the table and no further, and there was no sarcasm in it, no authority, just a statement, simple and direct. Samuel's gaze did not waver, but something shifted behind it, something old, something buried deep beneath years of distance. "Less noise that way," he replied, and the exchange was so calm, so understated, that it made the tension around them feel even sharper, because whatever history existed between these two men, it did not need to be explained, it did not need to be proven. It was simply there, present in the space between them, undeniable and unspoken. Lucas felt it like a current, his breath held without realizing it, while the rest of the room watched, confused but unable to look away. And then, without breaking eye contact, General Cross moved, his hand reaching slowly to the cuff of his sleeve, fingers steady, deliberate, and in that single motion, something in the room shifted again, deeper, heavier, like the final piece of a truth about to surface. The movement was slow, almost unnoticeable at first, but every eye in the room followed it, drawn by something deeper than curiosity. General Cross's fingers sliding along the cuff of his sleeve, pausing for just a fraction of a second, as if acknowledging the weight of what came next, then pulling the fabric back with quiet precision, revealing skin marked not by time alone, but by something far more deliberate, the same faded circle, the same 5 points etched into his forearm, older perhaps, weathered by years, but unmistakable, identical, and the effect was immediate, absolute, the kind of silence that does not just fill a room but replaces it entirely. Ethan Voss did not move, his breath caught somewhere between inhale and realization, his mind racing to reconcile what he was seeing with everything he thought he understood. Because symbols like that were not shared, they were not duplicated, they were not coincidence. They meant something specific, something controlled, something that did not exist in any system he had ever trained in. And yet there it was, on the arm of a 4-star general, displayed without explanation, without hesitation, Samuel Crow's expression did not change, not visibly, but his eyes held the mark for a moment longer than before, not in surprise, not in pride, but in recognition. The kind that runs deeper than rank or title. Still there, Samuel said quietly, his voice carrying just enough to reach the general, and Cross gave a small nod, not formal, not distant, but familiar. Always was, he replied, and the simplicity of the exchange cut through the tension more sharply than any command could have, because there was no performance in it, no authority being asserted, just truth being acknowledged, the kind that does not need to be explained to anyone who understands it. Lucas felt his pulse quicken, the pieces aligning in a way that made his earlier call feel insignificant, because whatever chain he had activated, it had already been too late. This was not a situation being discovered, it was one being remembered. Around the room, the other diners sat frozen in quiet confusion, sensing the gravity but unable to define it, while the Delta operators stood caught in a moment they could not control, their training offering no guidance, no protocol for what they were witnessing. Ethan finally shifted, just slightly, his posture tightening, as if instinct alone was trying to correct something that had already passed beyond his reach. "Sir," he said again, more carefully this time, the edge gone, replaced by something closer to restraint. But again the general did not look at him, did not acknowledge the attempt, because the moment no longer belonged to rank or structure, it belonged to something older, something buried beneath decades of silence. Cross's gaze remained on Samuel, steady, unwavering. "They did not brief you on this one," he said, not as a question, but as a statement, and Samuel let out the faintest breath, something that might have been the beginning of a smile if it had not faded before it fully formed. "They never did," he answered. And the weight of those words settled into the space between them, heavy and final, because whatever unit that symbol represented, whatever history it carried, it had been erased not just from records, but from memory itself, except for the few who had lived it. And in that moment, every man standing there understood one thing with absolute clarity. They had not been mocking a relic. They had been standing in front of something that had never been meant to be seen at all. The silence did not break. It deepened, settling into the bones of everyone in the room as the meaning of what they were seeing began to take shape. Not fully understood, not yet, but undeniable. Ethan Voss felt it first as pressure, a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with realization, because whatever that symbol meant, it existed outside the world he had trained in, outside the systems he trusted, and the fact that a man like General Cross carried it without hesitation meant it was not just real, it was protected. Samuel Crow rested his arm back on the table, the faded ink no longer exposed as a point of tension, but as something acknowledged, something complete, like a story that had just reached its final line without needing to be read aloud. The general let his sleeve fall back into place, the motion quiet, deliberate, as if returning something to where it belonged, and for a moment neither man spoke, the space between them filled with years that no one else in the room could see. Lucas Reed remained near the hallway, his posture rigid now, not from fear, but from awareness, because he understood enough to know he was standing in the presence of something that would never be written down, something that existed only in fragments, in memories carried by men who never spoke of them. Ethan finally stepped back half a pace, not ordered, not instructed, just instinct, the kind that told him this was no longer his ground to hold. His team followed without question, their earlier confidence gone, replaced by a quiet restraint that bordered on reverence. One of them glanced at Samuel, then quickly looked away, as if eye contact itself felt like a violation. General Cross shifted his stance slightly, the formal edge returning just enough to acknowledge the others now, his gaze moving briefly across the Delta operators, not judging, not reprimanding, but assessing, measuring the moment for what it was. "There are things," he said calmly, his voice steady and controlled, "that are not in your briefings." And the statement was not criticism, it was fact, delivered without weight, but carrying plenty of its own. Ethan nodded once, sharply, absorbing it, because there was no defense against something you were never meant to know. Samuel reached for his coffee again, lifting the mug with steady hands, the same quiet motion as before, as if nothing had changed, and in a way, for him, nothing had. The world had simply caught up for a moment, just long enough to recognize what had always been there. "You still come here often?" the general asked, his tone softer now, almost conversational, and Samuel gave a faint shrug, eyes returning to the window, to the reflection that held more history than anyone else could see. "Enough," he said, and the simplicity of it carried the same quiet finality as everything else he had spoken. The room began to breathe again, slowly, cautiously, conversations returning in hushed tones, but the atmosphere had changed permanently. Something unseen had passed through it, leaving behind a weight that would linger long after everyone had gone. Ethan Voss stood still for another second, then brought his hand up in a crisp, controlled motion, not exaggerated, not forced, just precise, a gesture of respect that needed no instruction, and one by one, the others followed, not out of protocol, but because something in them recognized that this was the only response that made sense. And through it all, Samuel Crow did not look back at them, did not acknowledge the gesture, because he did not need to. Respect had already been given. Whether spoken or not, the gesture did not echo with sound, but it carried through the room with unmistakable weight, a line drawn not by command but by understanding. And for a moment the distance between ranks, between generations, between what was known and what had been erased, all collapsed into something simple: respect given without question, without hesitation. Samuel Crow set his coffee down once more, the ceramic touching wood with the same quiet certainty as before, and this time he moved, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a slow shift as he pushed his chair back and rose to his feet, his posture straightening with an ease that did not match his years, as if the weight he carried had never bent him in the first place. General Cross watched him, not as a superior observing a subordinate, but as one man acknowledging another. And when Samuel stood fully, the space between them felt balanced, equal in a way that did not require explanation. Ethan Voss lowered his hand, the salute complete, but the feeling behind it remained, lingering in the set of his shoulders, in the way his gaze no longer searched for answers but accepted that some answers were not his to have. The rest of the team mirrored him, their movements controlled, their presence quieter now, each of them recalibrating something internal that had shifted beyond words. Lucas Reed stepped forward slightly, not enough to interrupt, just enough to be closer, his role no longer uncertain, his instincts confirmed, because what he had sensed from the beginning was now undeniable. This was not an incident. It was a moment of recognition, one that would leave no record but would never be forgotten by those who witnessed it. Samuel reached into his jacket, pulling out a few folded bills, placing them neatly beside the empty cup, a simple act, ordinary, almost mundane. And yet in that moment it carried a finality that no speech could match. He nodded once toward the waitress behind the counter, a quiet acknowledgment that belonged to a different world, a simpler one, then turned back toward the door. General Cross stepped aside without being asked, creating space not out of protocol but out of respect. And as Samuel moved past him, there was a pause, brief but real, a moment where neither spoke, neither needed to, the history between them already complete. "Take care of yourself," the general said finally, his voice low, steady, and Samuel gave the faintest nod, not looking back. "Always have," he replied, and then he walked, each step measured, unhurried, carrying him toward the door and out into the afternoon light, the bell above the entrance giving a soft chime as it opened, then closing again with a quiet final click, and just like that, he was gone, leaving behind a room that felt different, heavier, as if something invisible had passed through it and settled into the walls. Ethan stood still for a long moment, his mind replaying the last few minutes, not to understand them, but to accept them, because understanding was no longer the point. The point was what had been revealed, and what it meant about everything he thought he knew. General Cross remained where he was, his gaze lingering on the door for a second longer before turning back to the room, his presence still commanding, but now carrying something else beneath it, something quieter, something that only a few in that room would ever recognize. And without another word, he adjusted his sleeve, covering the symbol once more, returning it to silence. Where it had always belonged, the door had already closed, but the presence Samuel Crow left behind did not follow him out. It lingered, settling into the quiet corners of the diner like something that refused to be forgotten. Conversations resumed in low voices, cautious at first, as if speaking too loudly might disturb whatever had just passed through. But no one truly returned to what they had been saying before, because something had shifted, something that could not be undone. Ethan Voss exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just enough to release the tension he had been holding, but the weight remained, not physical, not immediate, but deeper, a recalibration happening in real time. His gaze moved briefly to the spot where Samuel had been sitting, then to the door, then finally to General Cross, searching not for answers, but for confirmation, for something to anchor what he had just experienced. The general stood still for a moment longer, then turned fully toward the team, his expression composed, controlled, but carrying a quiet gravity that needed no reinforcement. "You handled it," he said. Simply, not praise, not criticism, just acknowledgment. And Ethan gave a short nod, because anything more would have felt misplaced. One of the operators shifted slightly, his voice lower now, stripped of earlier confidence. "Sir, that unit," he began, then stopped, the words faltering before they could form into a complete question, because even asking felt like crossing a line he did not understand. General Cross studied him for a brief moment, then shook his head once, not dismissive, not harsh, just final. "It does not have a name you would recognize," he said. And that was all. No elaboration, no history, just a boundary drawn in calm, unmistakable terms. Lucas Reed stepped closer now, his earlier uncertainty replaced by quiet clarity, his role no longer reactive but aware. "Sir," he said, his voice steady, "should this be reported?" The question hung in the air, practical, procedural, exactly what he had been trained to ask. And for a moment the general did not answer, his gaze shifting briefly toward the window, toward the reflection of the street outside where Samuel had already disappeared into the flow of the day, then back to Lucas. "No," he said, the word simple, absolute. "There is nothing to report." And the meaning behind it was clear, not because of what was said, but because of what was not. This was not an incident, not a breach, not a situation to be documented or reviewed. It was something else entirely, something that existed outside systems and records. Ethan absorbed that in silence, the instinct to document, to analyze, to understand, all overridden by the realization that this moment was never meant to be captured, only experienced. One of the younger operators glanced again at the table, at the empty chair, the untouched space that now felt heavier than when it had been occupied. "He just walks away," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. And General Cross's gaze softened slightly, not with emotion, but with understanding. "He always does," he replied, and there was something in that answer that carried more history than any explanation could have. The room settled again, but not in the same way, the energy quieter, more grounded, as if everyone present had been reminded of something they had not known they had forgotten. General Cross adjusted his jacket, the sleeve now fully covering the symbol once more, hidden as it had been for years, then gave a final glance toward the door, not lingering, not searching, just acknowledging. And with that, he turned and walked out the same way he had entered, leaving behind a team that would never look at the world quite the same again, and a silence that did not feel empty, but full, like a story that had just been told without a single word needing to be written down. The diner slowly returned to its rhythm. But it was not the same rhythm as before. It was quieter, more measured, as if every sound now carried a little more weight than it had an hour ago. Ethan Voss remained where he stood, not out of uncertainty anymore, but out of reflection, his eyes drifting once more to the empty table by the window, the chair pushed in, the cup gone, the space clean and ordinary again. And yet it felt like something had been left behind, something that could not be cleared away or wiped down, something that would remain long after the last customer walked out, one of his team members finally broke the silence, his voice low, almost careful. "You think we will ever see him again?" Ethan did not answer right away, his gaze still fixed on that spot, replaying every moment, every word, every look, not searching for mistakes, but for understanding. And what he found was not clarity, but acceptance. "Maybe," he said finally, his tone steady, "but not like that." Because he understood now that what they had witnessed was not something that repeated, not something that could be scheduled or expected. It was something that happened when the past and present crossed paths just long enough to remind each other they still existed. Lucas Reed stepped forward, his posture relaxed now, but his eyes sharper than before, carrying a knowledge that had not been there earlier that day. "Sir," he said quietly, "what do we do with something like that?" The question was not procedural anymore. It was personal, and Ethan let out a slow breath, considering it, then gave a small shake of his head. "You remember it," he said, "and you do not talk about it like it is yours." Lucas nodded once, understanding more than the words themselves. Because some things were not meant to be explained, only respected, the team began to move again, small motions at first, adjusting gear, shifting weight. But the energy was different now, more grounded, more aware, like a lesson had been learned without anyone needing to teach it. Outside, the afternoon carried on without pause. Cars passing, people walking, the world continuing exactly as it always had. And somewhere in that movement, Samuel Crow blended back into it, just another figure on the sidewalk, unremarkable to anyone who did not know what to look for. And that was the point. Back inside, Ethan took one last look at the door, then turned away, his mind settled in a way it had not been before, not because he had answers, but because he no longer needed them. And as the team stepped out into the light, following their own path forward, the silence of what they had witnessed stayed with them, not as a burden, but as something steady, something grounding, a reminder that not every story is written, not every unit is named, and not every legend is meant to be seen. Some are simply carried, quietly, by the ones who were there, and for those who recognize it, even for a moment, that is enough.